has a way of reshaping identities. Countries head into conflict thinking they know who they are, and they come out the other side changed, sometimes strengthened, sometimes shaken, and often a mix of both. When we talk about Canada and the First World War, we usually reach for the familiar story. The young nation finding its voice at Vimy Ridge, the push through the 100 Days, the rise of a new national consciousness. Those are moments that show up in textbooks and Remembrance Day speeches, the parts of the past we've polished into something comfortable. But there's another side to that story. There's another side to that history, one that doesn't get the same airtime because it doesn't fit as neatly into the uplifting narrative. It's the story of how Canadian soldiers earned a reputation on the Western Front that surprised even their allies, not just for being capable or brave, but for something darker. They were relentless, they were ferocious, and at times they fought in ways that made people around them uneasy. Hello, and welcome to the 16th episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thanks for joining me again at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. The show exists because people like you care about the stories that rarely make the spotlight. If you want to help keep this project alive, upgrading gear, covering long nights of research, making time for episodes like this, you can support the show by heading over to buymeacoffee.com. Search for Memory and Valor, and you'll find my page. Even a single coffee makes a difference, and well, coffee is the best. Last but not least, if you're enjoying the podcast, please be sure to follow, like, and rate it wherever you're streaming from. On with the show. When most people picture the First World War, they think of big set piece battles like Vimy, the Somme, Passchendaele, those huge grinding offenses that swallowed entire divisions. But if you talk to the men or listen to the men who are actually there or read their letters and diaries, a different kind of moment keeps coming up. Not the grand attacks, not the sweeping movements on a map. What they remembered most vividly were the nights, the long, cold, silent hours when the trench felt too small and no man's land felt too close. The times when a handful of men climbed over the parapet with their faces blackened and their hearts pounding, knowing they were stepping into a kind of darkness that didn't show up in official histories. Because for the Canadians, those nights became something else entirely. Trench raids, especially, became one of the defining parts of the Canadian experience in the war. These weren't grand offensives or sweeping battles. They were small, violent, nighttime incursions into enemy lines carried out with their faces painted black and whatever improvised weapons a man could carry. So you weren't going in there necessarily, you were not taking your gun, generally. You weren't taking a bayonet. You might be taking a dagger or, like I said, whatever could be improvised. Officially, these trench raids were to gather intelligence, grab a prisoner, or throw the enemy off balance. But in practice, they eventually became something more, a kind of proving ground. This is where reputations were made, where units tested themselves, and where the usual rules of soldiering blurred under the pressure of fear, adrenaline, and the simple need to survive. Historians like Dr. Tim Cook have spent years trying to piece together what really happened in these raids. The stories that emerge are complicated. Moments of incredible bravery sit right beside actions that left deep marks on the men who carried them out. Some veterans spoke openly about what they had done. Others never said a word for the rest of their lives. And a lot of them carried a quiet sense of guilt or unease that never really went away. And this isn't about judging those men from a safe distance. It's not about condemning them or trying to excuse them. This is about trying to understand the world they were living in, a world where rules of war shifted constantly, where survival hinged on split-second decisions, and where the line between necessity and brutality could become impossibly thin. Over the next hour-ish, we're going to dig into how this reputation took shape, what fed into it, and how it ended up defining the Canadian Corps' role in the war. We'll wander through the culture of trench raids, the breakdown of those early fragile truces, the psychological shock of the first gas attacks, and the stories, both real and imagined, that circulated among the troops. We'll look at how Canadian units became the Empire's go to shock troops and what that actually meant for the men who had to live up to that label. And we'll hear from the veterans themselves whenever we can, in their own words, as they tried to make sense of what they'd been part of. So, this is a story about violence, sure, but it's also a story about identity, about how a country's image can be shaped just as much by its darkest moments as by its proudest victories. And it's about the men who carried those contradictions with them long after the war ended, long after the parades and the speeches faded away. So, settle in, grab a cup of tea, pull a blanket over you. It's a long story and a tough one, but it's worth telling. British war correspondents talked about the Canadians with this almost stunned admiration, like they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. They'd write that Canadian attacks had a grim determination, the kind of drive that felt personal, like the men were settling scores rather than just following orders. And the Germans picked up on it too. They learned to fear that little maple leaf badge, not because it was decorative, but because the men wearing it had a reputation for pushing forward when most units would have pulled back. By the last years of the war, the Canadians weren't just another formation in the line. They were the formation you called when you needed something impossible done. They were the Empire's shock troops. And the thing is, this reputation didn't come from some PR office in London or Ottawa. Nobody invented it. It came straight out of the mud, the wire, the darkness, out of those trench raids where you crawled across no man's land with your face blackened and your heart pounding. It came from night fighting, where you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, if that. It came from the breakdown of those fragile, unofficial truces that so many units relied on just to stay sane. A lot of soldiers on both sides quietly agreed to live and let live. Maybe you didn't shell the other side during breakfast. Maybe you didn't snipe at night. Little things that made life bearable. But the Canadians, they got a reputation for refusing those deals. Their commanders even bragged about it after war, held it up as proof that the Corps had discipline, backbone, the right kind of fighting spirit. But the truth is messier than that. The Canadians didn't reject those truces because they were naturally more disciplined or more bloodthirsty. They were shaped by what they'd been through. The gas at Ypres, the constant pressure of being used as assault troops, the stories that circulated through the trenches about German atrocities. Some of those stories were true, some were exaggerated, and some were pure trench folklore. But they all fed into this sense that the enemy wasn't just the other side. He was someone who had wronged you, someone you owed something to. And then there was the simple, brutal reality of trench warfare. It forced you into a kind of closeness with violence that most people can't even imagine. I know I can't. You weren't fighting at a distance. You were fighting in the dark and in the mud and sometimes face to face. And that changes people. So, if we want to understand how the Canadians earned this reputation for ferocity, we have to go back to the beginning, before the legend, before the shock troop nickname, before the Germans started calling them stormtroopers. When the first contingent arrived in France in early 1915, they weren't hardened veterans. They were volunteers from a young country, led mostly by British officers still figuring out how to survive in a trench. But the Western Front didn't give them much time to learn. It had a way of speeding up the process brutally and without mercy. If there's a single moment where Canadian reputation really begins, the moment veterans kept circling back to for the rest of their lives, it's Second Ypres. Everything starts there. So picture the scene: late afternoon, tea time, as we've said before, April 22nd, 1915. The Germans crack open more than 160 tons of chlorine gas. the first large-scale gas attack in history, and let it roll across the fields toward the Allied line. So there's this green-yellow cloud, thick as fog, twice as deadly, drifting straight toward the French 45th and 87th Divisions. The Canadians are just to their left, holding the flank under Major General Edwin Alderson. Remember, we talked about this in a previous episode about gas. So the Canadians don't get hit by the gas directly. They get hit by something worse. The collapse of the French colonial troops beside them. One moment there's a solid line of men. The next there is a 6.5 kilometer wide hole in the Allied front. And the Canadians are staring straight into it. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, yes, that McCrae, the man who wrote In Flanders Fields, scribbled in his diary that night, quote, "It was a nightmare. Men were suffocating in the trenches, dying like flies." End quote. And he wasn't exaggerating. Remember, he was a physician. The Canadians had no gas masks, none. They were told to urinate on handkerchiefs and hold them over their mouths. That was the best advice anyone had. So they fought with burning lungs, coughing so hard they could barely breathe, not knowing if the next breath would be their last. And somehow they held. British commander Sir John French summed it up in one line, quote, "The Canadians saved the situation," end quote. And that's really the first seed of the whole reputation, the idea that Canadians would stand and fight under conditions that would break other units. It wasn't myth-making and it wasn't patriotic spin. It was what happened. But Ypres did something else to them too, something darker. The gas attack felt like a betrayal. Many Canadians believed it broke the rules of war, that it had crossed a line, and really it had, because in 1899, the Hague Convention forbade the use of asphyxiating gas in war. So in the weeks that followed, you can hear the shift in their letters home. The tone hardens, and the patience thins. Private Harold Simpson of the 13th Battalion wrote to his family, quote, "We will give them no quarter after this," end quote. That wasn't official policy and it wasn't every soldier, but it was a turning point, sort of a psychological crack that would widen over the next 3 years. Second Ypres didn't just test the Canadians, it changed them. It marked the moment when the war stopped being an adventure and became something far more personal. And the Western Front, as it turns out, was just getting started. After Second Ypres, the Canadians were moved into what the brass liked to call quieter sectors, places like Festubert, Givenchy, and a place they called Plug Street. And sure, compared to a chlorine gas attack, anything feels quiet, but on the Western Front, quiet was a relative term. It still meant mud that could swallow you up, lice that never left you alone, random shells that landed whenever they felt like it, and snipers who only needed one good shot to ruin your day. These months were the real education. This is when the Canadians learned the daily grind of trench life, the routines, the rhythms, the thousand little dangers that didn't make headlines but killed just the same. And it's also when they learned the culture of the trenches, which is something people don't talk about enough. Because for all the violence, there was a kind of culture out there, an unspoken agreement in many sectors called live and let live. And it wasn't official and nobody ever admitted to it, but everyone knew how it worked. So we said before, maybe you didn't fire at breakfast, maybe you didn't snipe at night, maybe you let the other side repair their wire if they let you repair yours. Little things that made survival just a little bit more manageable. But the Canadians, they didn't always fit into that system. British officers noticed it early. Canadian battalions were more likely to fire aggressively, to patrol aggressively, and to raid aggressively. Some of that was inexperience. They were still figuring out the rules of the game. Some of it was temperament. A lot of these guys were volunteers who didn't come from the rigid class structures of the British Army. And some of it was deliberate. There's an entry in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry War Diary from December 8, 1915 that says it all. Quote, "Enemy opposite appears to desire quiet. Our men instructed to maintain offensive spirit." End quote. That phrase, offensive spirit, pops up again and again in Canadian orders. It became almost a mantra. The idea was simple. Don't let the enemy get comfortable. Don't let the line go stale. Keep the pressure on. And whether the men liked it or not, that mindset started to shape them. It pushed them out into no man's land more often, and it made them raid more often. It made them take risks that other units avoided, and slowly, almost without realizing it, the Canadians began to develop this reputation. Not yet the full shock troop legend, but the early outlines of it. They were becoming the unit that didn't sit still, the unit that pushed back, and the unit that didn't play by the quiet rules of the trenches. And the Western Front noticed. If Second Deep planted the seed of the Canadian reputation, trench raiding is what really made it grow. Raids were these small, violent, late night dashes across no man's land, meant to grab intelligence, get a prisoner, or just make the enemy's life miserable. But they quickly became something more than that. They turned into a kind of proving ground, a place where battalions showed what they were made of. And the Canadians, they took to trench raiding with an enthusiasm that surprised even their British commanders. By early 1916, the higher ups were already noticing that the Canadians were running more raids, and more ambitious ones, than many British divisions. One British staff officer wrote almost with a raised eyebrow, quote, "The Canadians are keen on raiding, perhaps too keen." End quote. And he wasn't wrong. These raids were brutal, up close, chaotic affairs. They happened in pitch darkness with faces smeared in soot and weapons chosen for silence. So, homemade clubs, knives, revolvers, grenades. Captain Charlie MacDonald of the 43rd Battalion described one raid in March 1916 like this, quote, "It was over in minutes. A shout, a scramble, the crash of bombs, and then we were gone again into the dark." End quote. And that's what these raids were. They were fast, violent, and deeply personal. And the Germans noticed it too. Their regimental histories started referring to the Canadians as Sturmtruppen, stormtroops, long before the term became famous. The next big step in the Canadian reputation came at St. Eloi, a miserable, confusing battle fought in landscape that barely qualified as Earth anymore. The British had blown a series of massive mines under the German lines, leaving behind a moonscape of water-filled craters and mud so deep it could swallow a man or a horse. Into this mess marched the 2nd Canadian Division under Major General Richard Turner. The front lines were so churned up that nobody could tell where anything was. Units got lost and positions changed hands without anyone realizing it. Casualties were heavy, and the whole thing ended without a clear result. But here's the thing. Reputations aren't built on neat tactical outcomes. They're built on impressions, and St. Eloi left an impression. A British officer watching the Canadians fight wrote, quote, "The Canadians fight like men possessed." End quote. Sometimes that was said with admiration, sometimes with a hint of unease. Either way, people were paying attention. Then came Mount Sorel or Mont Sorel, the Canadians' next major test. In June 1916, near Hooge, the Germans launched a surprise attack on the Canadian-held ridge. They hit the 3rd Canadian Division hard, overwhelming their positions and taking key ground. This could have been a disaster, but the counterattack was led by Major General Arthur Currie, who was still commanding the 1st Canadian Division at the time. Currie wasn't flashy, but he was meticulous. He insisted on proper artillery support, rehearsals, clear objectives, all the things that sound boring until you realize they save lives. And just a key note here is that Arthur Currie was also a Canadian. On June 13th, the Canadians counterattacked and took back everything they'd lost. A German officer from the 26th Reserve Division wrote afterward, quote, "The Canadians are stubborn fighters. They do not know when they are beaten." End quote. And that's the moment the reputation shifts. Not just brave, not just steady, but relentless. So by the end of 1916, the Canadian Corps was no longer the inexperienced colonial outfit that had stepped onto French soil the year before. They'd been tempered, brutally by everything the Western Front could throw at them. These were the men who had stood in the chlorine clouds at Ypres, who had slogged through the mud and confusion of St. Eloi, and who'd fought their way back up the shattered slopes of Montserrat. They'd buried friends in the fields of Flanders. They'd learned the rhythms of trench warfare the hard way. And in long stretches between major battles, they'd developed a reputation for something else, kind of instinctive aggressiveness. Their trench raids became a signature, bold, confident, and often ferocious. And as the months wore on, the Canadians grew less and less interested in the quiet, unspoken truces that governed so many sectors of the line. Where other battalions eased off, the Canadians were encouraged, even expected, to keep the pressure on. So word spread. British commanders noticed their effectiveness and their willingness to take on difficult tasks, their refusal to be worn down by the grind. German units started talking about them with a mix of respect and apprehension. Intelligence reports described them as stubborn, aggressive, and unnervingly persistent. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about the part of the Canadian Corps' reputation that doesn't fit neatly into the heroic narrative. That's the part that's harder to sit with because alongside all the praise for their discipline and effectiveness, there is this other thread running through the historical record. It's uncomfortable, but it's there and it's verified. So we know by now that the Canadians could be ruthless, not in the cartoonish, exaggerated way that modern internet myths like to portray, but in the real documented sense that comes from soldiers pushed past the limits of restraint by trauma, fear, and the sheer brutality of the Western Front. Historians like Tim Cook and Desmond Morton have gone through the diaries, the letters, the court martial records, and the eyewitness accounts. And what they found is that some Canadians crossed lines, not because they were monsters, but because the war itself was monstrous. One of the clearest patterns is what happened right after an assault, when a position had been taken at the cost of Canadian lives. In those moments, surrendering Germans were sometimes killed on the spot. Canadian lieutenant admitted that after losing half his company in an attack, he and his men refused a German surrender and killed the group outright. This wasn't rumor. This was his own testimony. There were also cases where officers gave explicit no prisoners orders before an attack. A 16-year-old private remembered being told in 1916, "I don't want any prisoners." And he would have been told that by his commanding officer. Another veteran recalled hearing before Vimy Ridge, "No prisoners, they'll just eat your rations." So these weren't official corps level policies, but they were real local orders given in the heat of an awful war. And then there were the moments of personal collapse. Soldiers who admitted in their own handwriting that grief or rage had overtaken them. One man wrote after Vimy that once he killed his first German, quote, "My blood was riled," end quote, and he shot any enemy he couldn't reach with his bayonet. He compared it to hunting, a chilling reminder of how war can warp a person's sense of right and wrong. There were even a few cold-blooded killings, rare but documented. One Canadian slipped a live grenade into the pocket of a German prisoner. Historians don't rely on rumors for this. It appears in multiple accounts from the time. And of course, the trench raids. The Canadians became famous or infamous for their nighttime raids where the goal was speed, surprise, and silence. These raids were officially about reconnaissance or capturing prisoners, but they often turned into violent, close quarters fights where wounded Germans were sometimes killed rather than brought back. Again, not myth, documented in diaries and reports from both sides. All of this fed into the reputation the Canadians carried by 1917 and 1918. German units called them no mercy soldiers. Some Canadians even leaned into it. One bragged that the Germans called them the White Gurkhas. Another wrote home that Canadians very seldom now take prisoners, and that captured Germans often did not march far. None of this was universal. None of it was official policy, but it happened. And it happened enough that it became part of how the Canadians were seen, how they were perceived, and part of how they saw themselves. And it's important to say this plainly. These acts didn't come from some innate cruelty. They came from a war that stripped away restraint from men who had been gassed, shelled, sniped at, and asked to do the impossible again and again. They came from trauma, from fear, and from the desperate need to survive. This is the shadow side of the Canadian Corps' reputation. The part that complicates the legend, and the part that reminds us that even the most celebrated soldiers were human beings, shaped by a war that pushed them past the edge. So something fundamental had shifted here. The Canadian Corps was no longer just a group of volunteers from a far off dominion. They were becoming something harder, more seasoned, and increasingly feared. A formation capable of extraordinary endurance and, when necessary, extraordinary violence. The reputation that would follow them through the rest of the war was already taking shape, forged in mud, fire, and relentless pressure of a conflict that demanded everything they had. We're going to kind of move now from the tactical aspect of this into kind of the psychology behind trench raiding and the breakdown of restraint. So we'll go back in time just a wee bit. So by early 1916, the Canadians had settled into the miserable rhythm of trench life. The mud that never dried, the lice that never left, the random shells that landed whenever they pleased. But underneath all that routine, something else was happening. The Canadians were developing this reputation for a very particular kind of fighting, the kind that demanded nerve, aggression, and a willingness to cross psychological lines that many soldiers on the Western Front never even approached. And that reputation was forged in the strange, shadowy world of the trench raid. Raiding wasn't just a tactic, it was almost a ritual. And you can see that shift happening as early as December 1915 when the PPCLI noted in their war diary that the enemy appears to desire quiet. But the Canadians were instructed to maintain offensive spirit, so that phrase, offensive spirit, becomes kind of a mantra for the Corps. For the men who actually went over the parapet, raiding was unlike anything else in the war. Will R. Bird of the 42nd Battalion later wrote, quote, "A raid was a thing apart. You felt yourself changing as you waited for the word to go, becoming something harder, something you did not recognize." End quote. And that's exactly how veterans described it. Before a raid, the men blackened their faces with soot, stripped off anything shiny, and picked weapons meant for silence. They weren't the same men who had marched through Valcartier or Salisbury Plain. Something in them shifted. Fear mixed with adrenaline and hesitation became dangerous. Donald Fraser, the meticulous diarist of the 31st Battalion, captured that moment perfectly. Quote, "There is a tightening in the stomach that no man can deny, but once you're over the parapet, it leaves you. You become all movement and purpose." End quote. Fraser's diaries show the transformation happening in real time. Fear giving way to instinct, instinct giving way to a kind of grim professionalism. And the raids themselves, they were intimate, the kind of fighting that left no room for illusions. Gregory Clark, then a young lieutenant with the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, later wrote, quote, "It was close work, the closest you can imagine. You knew the enemy as a shape, a breath, a movement in the dark." End quote. That closeness, that physical proximity, changed men. It forced them into a mental space that was hard to step back from. James Butterworth was born in England and emigrated to Canada in 1907 with his parents and siblings. His family moved to Alberta, where they became farmers. He enlisted in the CEF on October 27, 1915, with the 65th Battalion, and he joined the 46th Battalion after that. He served in France, And he left the service on 26 February 1919 at the rank of private. In this interview with Veterans Affairs Canada, he tells us a little bit about trench raiding performed by Canadians.
There were sometimes 6, 8, at the most 10. On each raid, we had some objective in mind. We were instructed to try and do this, try and do that, go and blow out a dugout, or go and bring back a couple of prisoners, or whatever. How we maneuvered to accomplish this, I've forgotten. But it was done so slick. We have to remember, of course, the Germans weren't asleep. They had their men on the front line also. So how we did it, I don't remember. But we got between two of them. Two of us would then enter the trench. Another fellow, either right or left, would tap his tin helmet or cough or make some noise to attract the attention of the guard at the dugout. He would naturally turn to see. When we first started, we carried rifles. And later, rifles are very, very awkward to pack under and over barbed wire through concertina wire and various wires. A Colt revolver was issued, and that is what we used from then on. Now, as a German soldier was attracted to the left, for instance, as prearranged, when he looked back, one of our revolvers was 5 inches from his nose. Down would go the rifle, and up would go his hands. I come with you, yes, please. So we say, up. And away he would go. How, I don't remember just how we accomplished all this, but I made more range than I have fingers and toes.
Canadians embraced raiding more enthusiastically than many British units. Some of that came from leadership, and some of it came from the memory of Ypres. The gas, the panic, the sense that the Germans had broken the rules of civilized warfare. And some came from the men themselves who found in raiding a way to strike back, to feel like they had some control in a war that otherwise offered none. Talbot Papineau, the charismatic officer of the PPCLI, wrote in 1916, quote, "Our men have taken to these night forays with a spirit that surprises even me. They are eager for them, perhaps too eager." End quote. Papineau's letters show a man both proud of his troops and quietly worried about what the war was turning them into. The Germans noticed this too. A Bavarian regimental history from 1916 described the Canadians as, quote, "restless fellows. They come in the night like shadows." End quote. Another German officer writing after a raid near Hooge observed, quote, "The Canadians fight with a wildness we do not see in the English." End quote. So these weren't compliments, they were warnings when you think about it. One of the hardest parts of raiding was the question of prisoners. Raids were fast and chaotic. Capturing a prisoner meant slowing down, wrestling someone who might fight back, and then dragging him across no man's land while the enemy shot at you. George Bell, a sergeant of the 8th Battalion, put it bluntly, quote, "A prisoner could cost you your life. You had to decide in a heartbeat what to do." End quote. That's the moral fog of raiding. The split-second decisions made in darkness, in mud, with adrenaline pounding in your ears. The war created moments where the line between necessity and brutality blurred, and where men acted in ways they later struggled to explain or just didn't discuss. By mid 1916, raiding had become routine for many Canadian units. What had once been extraordinary was now just part of the job. Will Bird captured that transformation with painful clarity. Quote, "The first time shakes you to the core. The second hardens you. After that, you are no longer the man you were." End quote. Take a moment to absorb that. That's the heart of it. The breakdown of restraint wasn't a single moment, it was a slow erosion shaped by fear, anger, training, and the demands of a war that rewarded aggression. By the end of 1916, the Canadian Corps had become something new. They struck first, they struck hard, they didn't yield. Raiding had taught them how to move, how to fight, and how to survive, but it had also taught them something else, something that would shape every battle to come, including Vimy Ridge. The Canadians didn't set out to become ruthless, but the war pushed them in that direction, and raiding was the crucible where that transformation took place. Some people have said to me that the Canadians developed this reputation for ruthlessness, this elite division, because the British High Command found them to be nothing more than expendable. With that, I disagree. And I believe this podcast will lay that out clearly. Now, we're going to talk about this one story from the First World War that hits you in the chest the first time you hear it. It's a story so shocking and so visceral that it spread through the Canadian trenches like a spark in dry grass. And even though historians like Tim Cook have taken it apart piece by piece, it still lingers in the background of how we understand war. And definitely the internet has not been a great help. It's the story of the crucified soldier. The rumor went something like this. During the chaos of the Battle of the Second Ypres, remember this is where the Germans used chlorine gas for the first time, a Canadian soldier was captured by the Germans and nailed, literally nailed, to a barn door or a tree. Sometimes the story says he'd been bayoneted to the door. Sometimes it said he'd been left hanging in full view of his own comrades. The details changed depending on who was telling it, but the horror of it never did. So here's the thing. It didn't happen. Tim Cook combed through every record we have. Casualty lists, war diaries, eyewitness accounts, and there's nothing. There's no name, no unit, no location. The story collapses the moment you try to pin it down. But in 1915, none of that mattered because the men believed it. And belief in a place like Ypres was more powerful than fact. Cook points out that this rumor exploded right after the gas attack, when the Canadians had watched men die choking in green clouds, when they'd fought with urine-soaked handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, and when they felt the Germans had crossed every line of civilized warfare. Into that emotional chaos, the crucified soldier story landed like a punch to the chest, and it spread fast. Men whispered it in dugouts. They repeated it on sentry duty. They wrote about it in letters home. One soldier said it made the blood boil. Another swore it proved the Hun has no honor. Nobody could agree on the victim's name, but everyone agreed on the feeling, rage. And that's the real power of the story. It didn't shape the war because it was true. It shaped the war because it felt true. And in the trenches, felt true was often more dangerous than is true. Tim Cook argued that myths like this helped harden attitudes on the Canadian side. They didn't create ferocity out of nowhere. The war was already doing that, but they poured fuel on the fire. When you believe the enemy is capable of nailing a man to a door, restraint becomes harder to justify. Mercy becomes harder to extend. The line between survival and vengeance really starts to blur. And remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. These were men who had already been gassed, shelled, sniped at, and thrown into battles where entire companies disappeared in minutes. They were exhausted, traumatized, and angry. A story like this didn't need to be true to have an impact. It just needed to land at the right moment. So yes, the crucified soldier never existed, but the anger he inspired absolutely did. And that anger became part of the emotional engine that drove the Canadian Corps through the rest of the war, into Hill 70, into Passchendaele, into Amiens, all the way to the end. So the myth wasn't real, but the consequences were. That's the thing about stories like the crucified soldier. True or not, they left a mark. They fed into a growing sense among the Canadians that this wasn't just a war of trenches and artillery, it was personal. It was survival. It was a fight against an enemy they believed was capable of anything. So you add to that the gas at Ypres, the mud at St. Eloi, the chaos of Mount Sorel, and the long punishing months of night raids, and you start to see how the edges begin to wear down, and how restraint thinned, how anger hardened into something colder and something more durable. By the time 1917 rolled around, the Canadians were not the same men who'd stepped onto French soil 2 years earlier. They'd been shaped, sometimes warped, by everything they'd seen and everything they'd done. The fear, the rumors, the raids, the losses, the small brutalities that never made it into official reports, all of it settled into them. And that's the mindset they carried with them when they gathered beneath the long, pale spine of Vimy Ridge. You can see the change in their correspondence. Private Donald Fraser of the 31st Battalion, one of the sharpest diarists in the whole Corps, wrote late in 1916, quote, "We have become accustomed to the worst the Hun can offer. We know his tricks, and he knows we will not be shifted easily." End quote. This was the voice of a man who had survived everything the Western Front could throw at him. These were the same men who'd stood in the chlorine clouds at Ypres, where John McCrae wrote that the battlefield was a nightmare, men dying like flies. They were the men who slogged through the mud at St. Eloi, where Captain Charles Savage called the ground a quagmire of filth and death. They were the men who fought their way back up Mont Sorel into a counterattack so fierce that a German officer later admitted the Canadians were stubborn fighters who do not know when they are beaten. All of that, every battle, every raid, every loss, hardened the Corps. And that hardness shaped everything that happened next. So when the Canadians were handed the job of taking Vimy Ridge, there was this unspoken understanding in the British High Command. If anyone can do it, it's them. The French had bled horribly trying to take the ridge in 1915, and the British hadn't done much better. Now it was the Canadians' turn. Major General Arthur Currie, commanding the 1st Division at that point, because remember, back at the time of Vimy Ridge in the spring of 1917, the Canadian Corps was still being commanded by Julian Byng. So Arthur Currie, at that time, understood exactly what was at stake. He'd watched the Corps evolve from raw recruits into a disciplined, battle-tested army. Currie believed in preparation, meticulous, almost obsessive preparation. But he also believed in the offensive spirit that had come to define the Canadians. Well, he was Canadian himself, so can you blame him? In a memorandum before the attack, he warned, quote, "Success will depend on every officer and man knowing his duty and doing it without hesitation." End quote. And the Corps took that to heart. Behind the lines, they built full-scale replicas of the German trenches. Units rehearsed their movements over and over until they could walk the routes blindfolded. This kind of preparation was not common on the Western Front, but it fit the Canadians perfectly. They were used to operating aggressively in the dark and used to coordinating with small groups under pressure, used to the kind of initiative that trench raiding had drilled into them. Sergeant George Bell of the 8th Battalion remembered the feeling in the days before the attack. Quote, "We knew our work. We had gone over it until it was second nature. There was no doubt in the ranks, only the wish to get on with it." End quote. So when the assault finally began at 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, the Canadians moved with a discipline and determination that stunned everyone watching. The creeping barrage, that rolling wall of artillery fire, moved forward across the ridge, and the infantry followed it with a precision that had been drilled into them for weeks. Lieutenant Gregory Clark of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles later described the moment the barrage lifted. Quote, "It was as if the whole line rose at once. No shouting, no confusion, just a steady, relentless advance." End quote. The German defenders, many of them hardened veterans of Verdun and the Somme, were caught off guard by the speed and the cohesion of the attack. Because remember, the French and the British had both previously failed to take the ridge. A German officer of the 79th Reserve Division later wrote, quote, "The Canadians attacked with a fury and precision that left us no time to recover." End quote. The toughest fighting came on the northern flank, where the 4th Canadian Division struggled against the strong point known as the Pimple. It was called that because it was just this very small bump kind of on the ridge. But across most of the front, the Canadians pushed forward with a momentum that felt almost unstoppable. They cleared trenches, stormed dugouts, and kept moving through sleet and machine gun fire and the same relentless drive that had defined their raids. By midday, most of the ridge was in Canadian hands. By the end of the week, the last German positions had fallen. We're going to have a listen now to Canadian veterans who were recorded in 1964 by CBC, and this was aired as a CBC radio program in early 1965 called Flanders Field.
The Vimy line had been very quiet until the Canadians got there. And then, as usual, we immediately started stirring up trouble.
The French had held these trenches, and they were nice. And there were printed orders on little chunks of board on the support trenches. And these orders were that in the case of attack, all the outposts were to withdraw, and the support trench would be the line of defense. And the first day we were there, these were all torn off and replaced with orders that, in case of attack, the line of defense were the outpost line.
Nearly every time we were in, we made a little raid. And the Germans never raided us once. We believe they tried it one night. We saw a man stand up in the wire, but nobody ever got in our trench.
For the men who fought there, Vimy Ridge wasn't just another victory. It was the culmination of everything they had endured since 1915. Private Donald Fraser captured that feeling in a letter home in April 1917. Quote, "We have done what was asked of us. It cost us dearly, but we have shown what our Corps can do." End quote. The hardened mindset of the Canadian Corps, forged in fear, anger, discipline, and relentless experience, shaped Vimy Ridge from the first planning meeting to the final assault. Vimy wasn't just a triumph of arms. It was the moment when the Corps' reputation, built over 2 years of brutal fighting, became undeniable. After Vimy, the Canadians were handed a new job: take Hill 70, a commanding height overlooking the mining city of Lens. The British High Command wanted a diversion, something to pull the German reserves away from the French. But Arthur Currie, newly promoted to Corps Commander at this point, wasn't about to throw his men into a pointless street fight in Lens. He pushed back, insisting that they take the hill instead. From there, the Canadians could force the Germans to counterattack uphill straight into the prepared positions. So basically, in order to take Lens, Currie suggested that rather than taking Lens directly, he said, let's take the hill. We will catch the Germans' attentions, divert them away from Lens itself to the hill. We'll have other guys waiting to the north, and we'll take the town of Lens at that point. So the attack began on the morning of 15 August 1917. The 1st and 2nd Divisions moved in behind a perfectly timed creeping barrage and grabbed the crest quickly. You can listen to the whole story of this, incidentally, on, I believe it's the 3rd episode of the podcast, and that's called The Battle of Hill 70 and the Milburn Sacrifice. And that discusses not just the battle itself, but the loss of my great-grandfather and my great-granduncle in the Battle of Hill 70. So Currie knew the real fight was still ahead, and he was right. The Germans counterattacked again and again. 14 times in 3 days, a total of 21 times in 10 days, throwing some of their best units at the hill, including the 4th Guards Division and the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. Donald Fraser, fighting with the 31st Battalion, captured the atmosphere perfectly in his diary. Quote, "The Hun came on again and again, and we met him with a fury I have not seen before. There was no thought of quarter on either side." End quote. The Canadians threw everything they had into holding the line: machine guns, rifle grenades, Stokes mortars, and the effect was devastating. German accounts back this up. The 11th Bavarian Regiment wrote, quote, "The Canadians attacked with a ferocity that left no time for surrender." End quote. Hill 70 cost the Canadians more than 9,000 casualties in 10 days. But they inflicted an estimated 20,000 German casualties in return. It was a tactical victory, yes, but more importantly, it marked a psychological turning point. The Corps had become a formation that dealt out enormous punishment and absorbed it in return, fighting with a grim, unyielding determination that was becoming impossible to ignore. So if Hill 70 hardened the Corps, Passchendaele nearly broke it. The Ypres salient was one of the most miserable places on the Western Front. A low, waterlogged basin surrounded by a German-held high ground. After months of British and Anzac attacks, for those who don't know, Anzac is kind of shorthand for Australian and New Zealand, the battlefield had been churned into a swamp of mud, water, and decomposing bodies. Shells created craters that filled instantly with filthy water. Men drowned in them. Horses simply disappeared into the mire. Currie protested the order to send the Canadians in at Passchendaele, warning that the Corps would suffer 16,000 casualties. He was almost exactly right. At the end of the Passchendaele battle, I think he was only about a couple of hundred casualties off of that number. The Canadian Corps entered the line in mid-October 1917. Their objectives included the Bellevue Spur, Crest Farm, and finally the Passchendaele Ridge itself. The fighting was carried out in knee-deep mud under constant shell fire. Machine guns were dug into concrete pillboxes that had survived months of previous bombardment. Gregory Clark, fighting with the 4th CMR, later wrote, quote, "Passchendaele was not war. It was a kind of slow murder, and we were all changed by it." End quote. The Canadians advanced in short, brutal pushes, 500 yards here, 300 yards there, each one costing hundreds of lives. On the 30th of October, 1917, during the assault on Crest Farm, Talbot Papineau was killed by shell fire. Shortly before his death, he had written, quote, "We have become accustomed to sights and actions that would have horrified us once. The war has made us into something we scarcely recognize." End quote. The final assault on November 6, 1917, captured the ridge, but at a staggering cost. 15,654 Canadian casualties. I'd also like to mention on that same night, October 30th to about November 1st, 1917, over that 48-hour period is when my friend John MacDonald's grandfather, Private Huey John MacDonald, a runner, was awarded the Military Medal for bravery. Interesting tidbit. And their episode number 5 of our podcast is all about Private Huey John MacDonald. Passchendaele was the moment when the Corps crossed the psychological threshold yet again. They'd been hardened before, and now they were something else entirely. A formation that had seen the worst the war could offer and still kept going. So now, if Passchendaele was the breaking point, Amiens was the moment the Canadians came roaring back, harder, sharper, and more dangerous than ever. The Allied offensive at Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918, marked the beginning of the 100 Days. Now, some refer to this as the 100 Days Offensive. Canadians tend to call it Canada's 100 Days. Either way, this was the final push that would end the war. The Germans called it the Black Day for Germany. And right from the start, the Canadians were placed at the very tip of the spear, alongside the Australians. By this time, everyone, British, French, German, knew exactly why. The Canadians had become the most reliable assault troop the British Army had. The attack itself was a masterclass in modern warfare. The Canadians advanced behind a massive creeping barrage supported by 580 tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and cavalry waiting to exploit any breakthrough. They'd move into position at night, using every trick of deception they'd learned over the past 3 years to hide their presence. When the attack began, the Germans had no idea the Canadians were even there. And the result was devastating. The Canadians surged forward up to 12 kilometers in a single day, a distance that would have sounded like fantasy anywhere else on the Western Front. A German officer with the 185th Infantry Regiment wrote afterwards, quote, "They come on like men who do not fear death. They give no rest and expect none." End quote. The Corps captured thousands of prisoners and dozens of guns, but the speed and violence of the assault came with a cost. Will Byrd, who fought through the entire 100 days, later wrote, quote, "We had seen too much to be gentle. Something in us had hardened beyond repair." End quote. And that's exactly where the Canadians were by Amiens, operating at a level of aggression that bordered on the ruthless. They were expected to break lines, seize objectives, and keep moving no matter what the cost. And they did it again and again. Amiens wasn't just another victory, it was the moment where the Canadians showed the world what shock troops really looked like. The Drocourt-Quéant line, sometimes, people like myself who can't speak French just call it the DQ line, wasn't just another German position. It was one of the strongest defensive systems on the entire Western Front. Think of it as a fortified belt of trenches, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and thick barbed wire, all tied into the larger Hindenburg Line. It was the backbone of a German defense, a place where they were sure the Allies would break their teeth. On the 2nd of September 1918, the Canadians, alongside the 1st British Division, were told to crack it open. And the job they were handed was brutal. Cross open ground under heavy fire, punch through multiple trench systems, and take fortified positions in close quarters fighting. It was the kind of attack that earlier in the war would have been considered suicidal. But by 1918, the Canadians weren't the same guys who'd arrived in France in 1915. Now they moved with confidence, or maybe a grim inevitability that came from years of surviving the worst of the Western Front. The assault unfolded like a textbook example of late war Canadian tactics. The creeping barrage rolled forward in tight, disciplined lifts, giving the infantry a moving shield of fire. Engineers followed close behind, cutting the wire and clearing paths through the defenses. Lewis gunners laid down suppressive fire, while rifle sections leapfrogged ahead, taking trench after trench in rapid succession. When they hit the concrete bunkers, they didn't stop. They flanked them, bombed the entrances, and forced the German defenders out or buried them inside. And they broke the line in a single day. The Hindenburg Line. In a single day. The Germans were stunned. This was a position they believed could hold for weeks, maybe months. Instead, the Canadians smashed through it with the same relentless momentum they'd shown at Amiens. George Bell, looking back on the battle years later, wrote, quote, "We were not the same men who'd come over in 15. Something had gone out of us and something else had taken its place." End quote. That something else was the collapse of restraint. The instinct to hesitate, to hold back, to show mercy. By the fall of 1918, the Canadians weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to finish the war, and nothing, not wire, not bunkers, not machine gun nests, was going to slow them down. By the end of the war, the Canadians had built this reputation that was impossible to ignore. They weren't just seen as reliable troops who could take any objective. They were viewed as the ones you called when something absolutely had to be done. And along with that came another reputation, one that made even seasoned soldiers raise an eyebrow. The Canadians were known for being ferocious, sometimes brutally so. English poet Robert Graves, who spent most of the war in the front lines, didn't mince words in his book, Goodbye to All That. He wrote that, quote, "The troops that had the worst reputation for acts of violence against prisoners were the Canadians." End quote. Coming from a man who saw the Western Front up close, that says something. British war correspondent Philip Gibbs, who witnessed more of the Western Front than almost anyone who hadn't enlisted, offered a slightly more sympathetic take. He said that the Canadians fought with a kind of personal vendetta, that they were more fixated on killing Germans than any other Allied troop. As he put it, quote, "The Canadians fought the Germans with a long, enduring, terrible, skillful patience." End quote. Surrendering Germans were most often killed in the heat of the moment, usually right after a position had been taken at the cost of Canadian lives. As one Canadian lieutenant put it after watching half of his company fall in an assault, quote, "We rushed them, and they had the nerve to throw up their hands and cry, "Kamerad." All the "kamerad" they got was a foot of cold steel through them. End quote. Some killings were colder than that. Others were driven by raw grief or rage. A soldier who lost a close friend at Vimy Ridge wrote later, quote, "Once I killed my first German with my bayonet, my blood was riled. Every German I could not reach with my bayonet, I shot. I think no more of murdering them than I used to think of shooting rabbits." End quote. It was a dark reputation, but again, it didn't come out of nowhere. We have to remember that. It came out of the losses they endured and the hardened mindset that the war carved into them. So again, in 1964, nearly 50 years after the Great War, Canadian veterans sat down with CBC to give interviews that became part of that 1965 radio program called Flanders Fields. Unfortunately, many of the veterans in this program are not named, but we can still listen to their voices.
A German officer was captured on a raid, and he said, "We know you're going to attack Vimy Ridge. We know all about your plans." He said, "You might get to the top of Vimy Ridge, but," he said, "I'll tell you this, you'll be able to take all the Canadians back to Canada in a rowboat that get there." Fortunately for us, he was wrong.
In 1919, Arthur Currie didn't sugarcoat what the war had been. He said bluntly, quote, "War is simply the curse of butchery, and the men who have gone through, who have seen war stripped of all its trappings, are the last men that will want to see another war." End quote. Coming from the man who had commanded the Canadian Corps, that wasn't rhetoric. It was a plain statement of what he'd watched his soldiers endure. Canadians had gone to France to win and to end a war, and the thinking at the time was brutally straightforward. Half measures only dragged things out. If you were going to fight, you fought to finish it as quickly as possible. Victoria Cross recipient Cy Peck put it in the simplest, starkest terms. Quote, "The Great War was one of ferocity, without chivalry, and sometimes without mercy." End quote. It was the mindset of men who had seen things up close, stripped of all the patriotic posters and speeches and propaganda, and who understood exactly what it had cost. If we really want to understand why the Canadian Corps carried such a fearsome reputation into the final years of the First World War, you eventually end up with historian Dr. Tim Cook. He was, without exaggeration, one of the finest interpreters of Canada's wartime experience. He was a gifted storyteller with the discipline of a meticulous researcher. His work reshaped how Canadians understand the Great War, stripping away the comfortable myths and replacing them with something far more human and far more complicated. Cook argued that by 1917 and 18, the Canadians had become the British Empire's unofficial shock army. The formation commanders called on, when they needed, precision, aggression, and results. Their reputation wasn't patriotic exaggeration. It was earned in the mud and fire of Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days. German accounts repeatedly described the Canadians as relentless attackers, men who pressed forward under the heaviest fire and sometimes seemed unwilling to take prisoners. But Cook was careful to show that this ferocity didn't appear out of thin air. As we've said, it was shaped by the brutal conditions of the Western Front, by the gas at Ypres, the intimacy of trench raids, by years of living with death as a constant companion. The Canadians were both victims of gas and later enthusiastic users of it. They raided at night with the blackened faces and homemade weapons. They learned to move fast, strike hard, and trust no white flag. Cook's research into battalion diaries and court-martial records revealed repeated instances where Canadian troops refused German surrender attempts, not out of cruelty, but more out of fear, trauma, and the knowledge that the surrender could be a trap. At the same time, Dr. Cook stressed that reputation and perception played their part. British commanders praised the Canadians publicly. Newspapers at home celebrated their victories. German soldiers, meeting them in battle, sometimes exaggerated their ruthlessness. But the core of the reputation was real. By 1917 and 1918, the Canadians were among the most battle-hardened troops on the Western Front. What made Cook's interpretation so compelling was that he never lost sight of the human cost. The ferocity that made the Corps effective was not something many veterans were proud of. It was something they carried quietly for the rest of their lives. Cook wrote about men who struggled with guilt, nightmares, and memories they rarely shared. Canada emerged from the Great War with a mighty reputation, but also with deep scars. And then there's the contrast Cook drew between real, documented ruthlessness and the myths that circulate today. His research shows Canadians sometimes refuse surrender in the chaos of trench fighting, but the popular online tale about Canadians tossing tins of corned beef into starving German trench and then throwing grenades when the enemy asked for more, Cook never mentioned it because it never happened. It appears nowhere in diaries, letters, or memoirs. It's a modern invention, a bit of French flavored folklore that survives because it sounds like something the Canadians might have done. And this currently, right now in 2026, is a hugely popular bit of folklore that's floating all around TikTok and Instagram and everything else. Watch for it. If you haven't seen it yet, you will soon, I'm sure. But keep in mind, it is not true. Dr. Cook's words remind us that the truth is already dramatic enough. The Canadians didn't need myths to seem fierce. The historical record, the real one, tells that story all on its own. The war didn't end when the guns stopped. It didn't end at the wire, or at the docks in Halifax, or when a man stepped back onto the prairie farmyard. It followed them all the way home. It lived in their heads and their bones, and it shaped the rest of their lives in ways that weren't always visible to the people around them. The ferocity that defined the Canadian Corps in 1917 and 18 didn't just evaporate with the armistice. It settled into the men who carried it. We talked about this last week when we dug into shell shock, but it's worth saying again. The battlefield came home with them. Some veterans tried to talk about what they'd seen. Others tried to bury it. Most did a bit of both, depending on the day. Will Bird, whose memoirs are still some of the most haunting accounts we have, wrote about the nights after he returned home. Quote, I would wake and see the faces of the boys who had fallen. They came as clear as if they stood beside my bed. End quote. Bird had survived the Somme, Vimy, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days. He'd watched his friends die in mud and wire. He'd fought in darkness with a knife in his hand. Those memories didn't fade. If anything, they sharpened. Donald Fraser, the soldier diarist from Alberta, wrote after the war, quote, there are moments when the mind goes back, unbidden, to the trenches. A sound, a smell, a sudden silence, and you're there again. End quote. Fraser's words could have been written by thousands of men. Ordinary things like a slammed door, a thunderstorm, the smell of damp earth could pull them straight back to the front. For others, the war came home as silence. Gregory Clark, who later became one of Canada's most beloved journalists, rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, even though he wrote about them with incredible clarity decades later. His son once said Clark carried the war inside him. And Clark himself admitted, quote, these were things we saw that we could not explain to those who had not been there. End quote. That inability, or maybe unwillingness, to explain created a quiet gulf between veterans and the people waiting for them. Families sensed it. Wives and children learned to navigate around it. Communities saw the outward wounds, the limps, the missing limbs, the coughing fits from gas, but the inner wounds were harder to name. Shell shock existed as a term, but it wasn't well understood. And a lot of men were told to toughen up, to get on with it, be men. And so they did, in whatever ways they could. Some drank. Some worked themselves numb. Some withdrew. Some snapped without warning. And some never found their way back at all. George Bell, who'd fought through some of the worst battles of the war, wrote, quote, you come home and people say the war is over, but it's not over for you. It is inside you, and you carry it wherever you go. End quote. Bell's words echo across countless testimonies. The war carved deep channels into their minds, and the world they returned to didn't have the language to understand that. Even the men who looked successful on the outside were often carrying something heavy. Talbot Papineau did not survive the war, but before Passchendaele, he wrote that the conflict had changed them into something they barely recognized. His friends carried that truth into post-war years. They had learned to act without hesitation, to suppress emotion, to survive at any cost. Habits that didn't just disappear when peace arrived. Tim Cook often wrote about the long shadow of the war, how it stretched across marriages, careers, friendships, and identities. Many veterans stayed silent not because they'd forgotten, but because they remembered too well. Silence became a kind of shield for themselves and for the people they loved. And yet, even with all that silence, the war seeped into Canadian society. It shaped how communities understood sacrifice, it shaped how the country saw itself, it shaped how veterans raised their children, how they worked, and how they moved through the world. The emotional aftermath of being a shock troop or a storm troop wasn't a footnote. It was the longest chapter in Canada's war. Some veterans found comfort in the company of other veterans. Legion halls became places where men could talk freely or not talk at all, but still feel understood. Others found solace in writing, diaries, letters, memoirs that historians like Cook would later draw from. And many carried their memories quietly or privately for the rest of their lives. The Canadian Corps had been forged in fire, and its reputation for ferocity was earned honestly, but the men who built that reputation paid a price that didn't end in 1918. They carried the war home. It stayed in their minds, in their dreams, and in the spaces between words. For many of them, the war never truly ended.
I don't think there was any despair, such a thing as that we were going to lose the war. It never occurred to anybody.
There was a sort of a twilight of the gods effect about it. And yet there was something, and I can only think it was discipline, that sustained us. We were a good regiment. We knew it. And I think that was all that was necessary to sustain us. I had lost most of my friends, but one felt, well, as they say today, that's just the way the ball bounces. There came with time a sort of deadening.
I would say that people came out of Passchendaele simply numb, mentally and physically. And I wouldn't have thought that many of us would have recovered from it. But c'est la guerre, and one good leave does an awful lot for a man, you know.
The conditions of Passchendaele were just about the worst you could possibly have anywhere. And yet those men, they were just as cheerful as they could be. And they always were. It just seemed to be that after you had been there a few months, it became a way of life. And while you wrote home and thought of home, the idea of ever getting home just didn't occur to you. And so they just made the best of it. They were always in such good spirits, no matter what they went through.
By the time the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the Canadian Corps stood at the very tip of the Allied spear. They had broken the DQ line, crossed Canal du Nord, liberated Cambrai, and driven the German army back across a front that had barely budged in 4 years. Their reputation, that hard, dangerous reputation forged in the mud of Ypres and the darkness of trench raids, was now fixed in the minds of both allies and enemies. And it was during these final months, the 100 days, that the Canadians picked up that nickname that would follow them into history: shock troops. The term didn't come from Canadian newspapers or patriotic speeches. It came from the British High Command. In dispatches and internal memos, senior officers began referring to the Canadians as the formation they turned to when they needed a decisive blow. These were the troops who could break a fortified line, seize a critical objective, or exploit a breakthrough with speed and precision. They were the troops who attacked without hesitation, adapted quickly, and fought with such ferocity that startled even seasoned British units. Arthur Currie never used the phrase publicly, but British commanders did, and German officers did too, though they used a different word: Sturmtruppen, stormtroop. Originally, that term belonged to Germany's own elite assault units, the infiltration specialists of 1917 and 1918. But as the war ended its final phrase, German reports began applying the same label to the Canadians. Interesting. In an odd way, it may almost be a compliment. A Bavarian officer wrote after Amiens that the Canadians attacked with the fury of storm troops, and another German account described them as the most dangerous of the English divisions. They meant English in the imperial sense, but they singled out the Canadians as something distinct, something more aggressive, and something to be feared. Tim Cook returned to this point again and again. The reputation wasn't myth, it wasn't post-war embellishment. It was something the Germans themselves believed. They had faced the Canadians at Vimy, Hill 70, Passchendaele, Amiens, Arras, Cambrai. The Germans had watched them advance through gas, mud, wire, and machine gun fire. They had seen them raid at night with a ruthlessness that ignored the old rules of trench warfare. The Germans had learned the hard way that when the Canadians were opposite you, the line was in danger. And so the name stuck. Shock troops, stormtroopers. Two sides of the same coin. One British, one German, both pointing to the same truth. By 1918, the Canadian Corps had become one of the most formidable assault formations on the Western Front. But reputations are double-edged. They elevate, but they also simplify. The Canadians weren't superhuman. They weren't born fierce. They were men, volunteers, farm boys, clerks, miners, students, shaped by a war that demanded everything they had. Their ferocity was not a natural trait. It was survival mechanism. It came from trauma, training, leadership, and circumstance, and it came from a war that stripped away restraint and rewarded aggression. Tim Cook understood this better than anyone. As a historian, he wrote about the Canadians' battlefield performance with admiration, but he never lost sight of the cost. Behind the legend of the shock troops were men who carried the war home with them, in their memories, in their nightmares, and in the silences that settled over their lives. And that's where we leave the story. Not with the march into Mons, not with the medals or the parades, but with the understanding that reputations, even earned ones, are only part of the truth. Canadian Corps became shock troops because the war demanded it. They became stormtroopers in the eyes of the enemy because they fought with relentless, terrifying efficiency. But they were also human beings, shaped and scarred by the very qualities that made them so effective. Their legacy isn't just victory. It's the complicated, painful, extraordinary story of what ordinary men became when history asked the impossible of them. And that's the story I want to carry forward. That in the end, the story of the Canadian Corps is not just the story of the battles won or reputations earned. It's the story of ordinary men asked to do these things. Men who became shock troops and stormtroopers in the eyes of the world and who carried the weight of that transformation long after the guns went silent. Their legacy lives not only in the ridges they took or the lines they broke, but in the quiet, complicated lives they lived afterward and down through the generations. A reminder that the cost of victory is never paid in full on the battlefield. And that brings us to the end of this journey this week, the 16th episode of Memory and Valour. Before we close, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Everyone listening, thank you for spending this time with me, for caring about the stories that rarely make the spotlight, and for helping to keep the memory of these soldiers alive. If you're enjoying the show, please consider following, liking, or rating it wherever you listen. It makes a bigger difference than you might think, and it helps bring these stories to people who may have never encountered them otherwise. You can visit my website to read the show notes, explore the books I've written about the First World War, or even begin a collaboration to create a legacy book about one of your family members who served. All of that is waiting for you at www.memoryandvalour.ca. Remember, that's Valor with an O-U-R, because we're Canadian. And I want to offer a special thank you to the late Dr. Tim Cook. His work, his storytelling, and his scholarship shaped so much of what we explored today. His voice continues to guide how we understand this history, and his legacy lives on in every conversation like this one. As we close today's episode, I hope you carry something with you, not just the battles or the dates, but the spirit of the men who lived through them. Keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.